After studying this module, you would know about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. You would also know about the 16 basic desires theory. You would understand the implications of motivation in education. You would understand the theory of self-determination and the theory of organismic integration or organismic integration theory, OTI. So, now let us first consider the incentive theories, that is the intrinsic and extrinsic motivation theories. Motivation can be divided into two different theories known as intrinsic, that is internal motivation, or extrinsic, that is external motivation. Let us now consider intrinsic motivation. As the topic at hand is developing intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation has been studied since the early 1970s. Intrinsic motivation is the self-desire to seek out new things and new challenges, to analyze one's capacity to observe and to gain knowledge. It is driven by an interest or enjoyment in the task itself, and it exists within the individual rather than relying on external pressures or as a desire for reward. The phenomenon of intrinsic motivation was first acknowledged within the experimental studies of animal behavior. In these studies, it was evident that organisms would engage in playful curiosity and would be driven by such behavior in the absence of reward as well. Intrinsic motivation is a natural motivational tendency and is a critical element in cognitive, social and physical development. Students who are intrinsically motivated are more likely to engage in the task of willingly as well as learning and as well as working to improve their skills, which will increase their capabilities. Students are likely to be intrinsically motivated if they attribute their educational results to factors under their own control, also known as autonomy or locus of control. Believe they have the skills to be effective agents in reaching their desired goals, also known as self-efficacy beliefs. Are interested in mastering a topic, not just in achieving good grades. An example of intrinsic motivation is when an employee becomes an IT professional because he or she wants to learn how computers users interact with the computer networks. The employee has the intrinsic motivation to gain more knowledge. What are the advantages of intrinsic motivation? Intrinsic motivation can be long lasting and self-sustaining. Efforts to build this kind of motivation are also typically efforts at promoting student learning. Such efforts often focus on the subject rather than the rewards or the punishments. What are the disadvantages? Efforts at fostering intrinsic motivation can be slow to affect the behavior and can require special and lengthy preparations. Students are individually also of a variety of approaches and may need to be motivated in different ways. it often helps to know that interests of one student in order to connect to these interests with subject matter. This requires getting to know one student better. Also, it helps if the instructor is interested in the subject in the beginning or not. Extrinsic motivation, on the other hand, refers to performance of an activity in order to attain a desired outcome, and it is the opposite of intrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation comes from influences from outside the individual. In extrinsic motivation, the harder question to answer is where do people get this motivation to carry out and continue to push with persistence. Usually, extrinsic motivation is used to attain outcomes that a person wouldn't get from intrinsic motivation. Common extrinsic motivations are rewards. For example, it could be in the form of money or grades for showing the desired behavior, and the threat of punishment for following misbehavior. Competition is an extrinsic motivator because it encourages the performer to win and to beat others, not to simply enjoy the intrinsic rewards of activity. A cheering crowd and the desire to win a trophy are also extrinsic incentives. Social psychology research has indicated that extrinsic rewards can lead to over-justification and a subsequent reduction in the intrinsic motivation. In one study, it has been demonstrated that children who expected to be and were rewarded with a ribbon or a gold star for drawing pictures spent less time playing with the drawing material in subsequent observations than those who were assigned an unexpected reward condition. However, another study showed that third graders who were rewarded with a book showed more reading behavior in the future, implying that some rewards do not determine intrinsic motivation. While the provision of extrinsic rewards may reduce the desirability of an activity, the use of extrinsic constraints such as the threat of punishment against performing an activity has usually found to increase one's intrinsic interest in that activity. In one study, when children were given mild threats against playing with attractive toys, it was found that the threat actually served to increase the children's interest in the toy, which was previously undesirable to the child in the absence of threat. Intrinsic motivation and the 16 basic desires theory. Starting from the studies involving more than 6,000 people, Professor Steve Rees has proposed a theory that found 16 basic desires that guide nearly all human behavior. Intrinsic motivation is the tendency to find challenges, to push, to find out for more, to explore and learn as much as possible. It is about reaching the most possible potential human being. The 16 basic desires that motivate our actions and define our personalities are the following: acceptance, the need for approval; curiosity, the need to learn; eating, the need for food; family, the need to raise children; honor, the need to be loyal and to the traditional values of one's clan or ethnic group; idealism, the need for social justice; independence, the need for individuality; order, the need for organized, stable and predictable environments, physical activity, the need for exercise, power, the need for influence of will, romance, the need for sex and beauty, saving, the need to collect, social contact, the need for friends and peer relationships, social status, the need for social standing and importance, tranquility, the need to be safe, vengeance, the need to strike back and to compete. Now let us look at motivation in the context of education. Motivation is of particular interest to educational psychologists, and we can take some lessons, some cues from this, because motivation plays a crucial role in student learning. However, the specific kind of motivation that is studied in the specialized setting of education differs qualitatively from the more general forms of motivation studied by psychologists in other fields. Motivation in education can have several effects on how students learn and how they behave towards subject matter. It can 1. Direct behavior towards particular goals. 2. Lead to increased efforts and energy. 3. Increase initiation of the persistence in activity. 4. Enhance cognitive processing. 5. Determine what consequences are reinforcing. 6. Lead to improved performance. Because students are not always internally motivated, they sometimes need situated motivation, which is found in the environmental conditions that the teachers create. If teachers decided to be extrinsically rewarding, then productive students' behavior would follow, and they may find it difficult to extricate themselves from that path. Consequently, student dependency on extrinsic rewards represents one of the greatest detractors from their use in the classrooms. Majority of new students orientation and the leaders at colleges and universities recognize the distinctive needs of students should be considered in regard to the orientation information provided at the beginning of higher education experience. The research done by White in 1986 raised the awareness of counselors and educators in this regard. In 2007, the National Orientation Directors Association reprinted Cassandra B. White's report, allowing readers to ascertain improvements made in addressing specific needs of students over a quarter of a century later to help with academic success. Generally, motivation is conceptualized as either intrinsic or extrinsic. Classically, these categories are regarded as distinct. Today, these concepts are less likely to be used as distinct categories, but instead as two ideal types that are defined in a continuum. Intrinsic motivation occurs when people are internally motivated to do something because it either brings them pleasure, they think they are learning and it is important to them, or they feel that their learning is significant. It has been shown that intrinsic motivation for education drops from 3rd to 9th grade, and though the exact cause is not ascertained. Also, in younger students, it has been shown that contextualizing material that would either be present in abstract manner increases the intrinsic motivation of these students. Extrinsic motivation comes into play when a student is compelled to do something or act in a certain way because of factors external to him or her, like money or grades. Cassandra B. White researched and reported about the importance of what is called the locus of control and academic achievement. Students tending towards a more internal locus of control are more academically successful, and thus encouraging curriculum and activity development with the consideration of motivation theories. Academic motivation orientation may also be tied to one's ability to detect the process of errors. Fisher, Nayankara and Marshall are some of the neuroscientists who researched on children's motivation orientation, neurological indicators of error monitoring, the process of detecting an error, and academic achievements. Their research suggests that students with high intrinsic motivation attribute performance to personal control, and that their error monitoring system is more strongly engaged by performance errors. They also found that motivation orientation and academic achievement were related to the strength in which the error monitoring system was engaged. Motivation can be found to be an important element in the concept of andragogy. What motivates adult learners, andragogy or andragogy, and in treating autism spectrum disorders and in pivotal response therapy. Doyle and Moyen have noted that traditional methods tend to use anxiety as a negative motivation. For example, the use of bad grades by teachers as a method of getting students to work. However, they have found that progressive approaches which focus on positive motivation over punishment has produced greater effectiveness with learning, since anxiety interferes with the performance of complex tasks. Now we are considering what is called the self-determination theory, SDT. SDT is centered on the belief that human nature shows persistent positive features, that is, repeatedly shows effort, agency and commitment in their lives, that the theory calls inherent growth tendencies. People have also innate psychological needs that are the basis for self-motivation and personality integration. Now, in this diagram you see that autonomy, competence and relatedness. These are the three elements which go towards self-determination theory. The self-determination theory identifies three innate needs that, if satisfied, allow optimal function and growth: competence, relatedness, autonomy. These needs are seen as universal necessities that are innate, not learned, and seen in humanity across time, gender and culture. Deci and Van Steenkist claim that there are three essential elements of the theory. Humans are inherently proactive with their potential and mastering their inner forces such as drives and emotions. Humans have inherent tendencies towards growth, development and integrated functioning. Optimal development and actions are inherent in humans, but they do not happen automatically. To actualize their inherent potential, they need nurturing from the social environment. If this happens, there is a positive consequence, well-being and growth. But if not, there are negative consequences. So, the SDT emphasizes humans' natural growth towards positive motivation. However, this is thwarted if their basic needs are not fulfilled. So let us now see what are basic needs. SDT supports 3 basic psychological needs that must be satisfied to foster well-being and health. These needs are universally applicable. However, some may be more salient than others at certain times and will be expressed differently based on time, culture and experience. So, competence. What is competence? Competence is to seek to control the outcome and experience mastery. Relatedness. Relatedness is the universal want to interact, to be connected to and experience caring for others. Autonomy. It is the universal urge to be a causal agent of one's own life and act in harmony with one's integrated self. However, Deci and the partner author Van-Steenkist note that this does not mean to be independent of others. Motivation. SDT claims to give a different approach to motivation, considering what motivates a person at any given time as opposed to seeing motivation as a unitary concept. SDT makes a distinction between different types of motivation and the consequences of them. So now let us come back to this question of intrinsic motivation in the context of SDT. Intrinsic motivation is the natural inherent drive to seek out challenges and new possibilities that SDT associates with cognitive and social development. So let us first look at cognitive evaluation theory. It is a sub-theory of SDT that specifies factors explaining intrinsic motivation and variability with it and looks at how social and environmental factors help or hinder the intrinsic motivation. CET, that is cognitive evaluation theory, focuses on the need of competence and autonomy. The claiming social context events like feedback on work or rewards leads to a feeling of competence and so enhanced intrinsic motivation. Deci found that a positive feedback enhanced intrinsic motivation and a negative feedback diminished motivation. Vallerand and Reed went further and found that these effects were being mediated by the perceived control. Autonomy, however, must accompany competence in order for people to see their behaviors as self-determined by intrinsic motivation. For this to happen, there must be immediate contextual support for both needs and inner resources based upon prior development, support for both needs. CET and intrinsic motivation is also linked to relatedness through the hypothesis that intrinsic motivation will flourish if linked with a sense of security and relatedness. Grolnick and Ryan found that lower intrinsic motivation in children who believed their teachers to be uncaring or cold and not so fulfilling their related needs. Now let us look at extrinsic motivation once again. Extrinsic motivation comes from external sources. Deci and Ryan developed another theory, which is again a sub-theory of SDT, that is known as organismic integration theory, OIT. It explains different ways in which extrinsically motivated behavior is regulated. OIT details the different forms of extrinsic motivation and the context in which they come about. This is the context such that motivation concerns the SDT theory, and these contexts affect whether the motivations are internalized and so integrated into the sense of self. OIT describes 4 types different and extrinsic motivations that often vary in terms of their relative autonomy. External regulated behavior is the least autonomous. It is performed because of external demands or possible rewards. Such actions can be seen to have external perceived locus of control. Introjected regulation of behavior describes taking on regulations to behave to behavior but not fully accepting the said regulations as your own. Deci and Ryan claim that such behavior normally represents regulation by contingent self-esteem, citing ego involvement as a classic form of introjections. This is the kind of behavior where people feel motivated to demonstrate ability to maintain self-worth. While this internally is driven, Deci and Ryan say that introjected behavior is on an externally perceived locus of control because they aren't perceived as a part of the self. Regulation through identification. It is a more autonomy driven form of extrinsic motivation. It involves consciously valuing a goal or a regulation so that said action can be accepted as personally important. Integrated regulation. This is the most autonomous kind of extrinsic motivation, occurring when regulations are fully assimilated with the self, so they are included in a person's self-evaluation and beliefs on personal needs. Because of this, integrated motivation shares qualities with intrinsic motivation but are still classified as extrinsic because the goals that are trying to be achieved are for reasons extrinsic to the self rather than inherent in the enjoyment or the interest of the task. Extrinsically motivated behaviors can be integrated into the self. OIT proposes internalization that is more likely to occur when there is a sense of relatedness. Ryan, Stiller and Lynch found that children will internalize schools' extrinsic regulations when they feel secure and cared by parents and teachers. Internalization of extrinsic motivation is also linked to competence. OIT suggests that feeling of competence in activities should facilitate internalization of said actions. Autonomy is particularly important when its regulations are trying to be integrated into the person's sense of self. If external context allows a person to integrate regulations, they must feel competent, related and autonomous. They must also understand in terms of their goals the regulations in order for a sense of autonomy to be facilitated. This was supported by Deci, Eghari and Patrick and Leon, who found that in laboratory settings, if a person was given a meaningful reason for uninteresting behavior along with support for their sense of autonomy and relatedness, they internalized and integrated their behavior. Now let us summarize what we have done so far. We have studied the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. We have looked at and examined and understood the 16 basic desires theory. We have understood in the context of education how motivation plays a role, and in this context what are the implications of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Then we have studied two very prominent theories. One is the theory of self-determination, SDT theory, and the other is the organismic integration theory, which of course is a derivative of the SDT theory.